This whimsical production appeared originally in 1819 in an Eton miscellany entitled The College Magazine, the poetry of which was afterwards selected, and only 50 copies struck off. These have been carefully suppressed, principally, we believe, on account of this article, as it contains nothing that we conceive can be deemed offensive and has allusions to almost all the distinguished scholars of that period, besides including the principal contributors to the Etonian, a recent popular work. We have with some difficulty filled up the blanks with real names, and, at the suggestion of several old Etonians, incorporated it with the present work, as a fair criterion of the promising character of the school at this particular period. The practice of thus distinguishing the rising talents of Eton is somewhat ancient. We have before us a copy of verses dated 1620, in which Waller, the poet, and other celebrated characters of his time are particularized. At a still more recent period, during the mastership of the celebrated Dr. Barnard, the present Earl of Carlisle, whose classical taste is universally admitted, distinguished himself not less than his compeers by some very elegant lines, those on the late right Hon. C. J. Fox we are induced to extract as a strong proof of the noble Earl's early penetration and foresight. How will my Fox alone, by strength of parts, shake the loud Senate, animate the hearts of fearful statesmen, while around you stand both peers and commons, listening your command? While Tully's sense its weight to you affords, his nervous sweetness shall adorn your words. What praise to Pitt, one to Townshend, ere was due, in future times my pox shall wait on you. At a subsequent period, the leading characters of the school were spiritedly drawn in a periodical newspaper, called The World, then edited by Major Topham, and the Rev. Mr. East, who is still, I believe, living and preaches occasionally at Whitehall. From that publication, now very scarce, I have selected the following as the most amusing and relating to distinguished persons. 1. The great Earl of Chatham. Recollections of an Old Etonian. The Lords Littleton father and son formed two opposite characters in their times. The former had a distinguished turn for pastoral poetry, and wrote some things at Eton with all the enthusiasm of early years, and yet with all the judgment of advanced life. The latter showed there, in some traits of disposition, what was to be expected from him, but he too loved the muses and cultivated them. He there too displayed the strange contraries of being an ardent admirer of the virtues of classic times, while he was cheating at chuck and all fours, and though he affected every species of irreligion, was, in fact, afraid of his own shadow. The whole North family have, in succession, adorned this school with their talents which, in the different branches, were various, but all of mark and vivacity. To the younger part, Dampier was the tutor, who, having a little disagreement with Frank North on the 100 steps coming down from the terrace, at Windsor they adjusted it, by Frank North's rolling his tutor very quickly down the whole of them. The tutor has since risen to some eminence in the church. Lord Comandelly was early in life a boy of great parts, and they have continued so ever since, though not lively ones. Earl of Buckingham was a plain good scholar, but would have been better at any other school, for he was no poet, and verse is here one of the first requisites. Besides, he had an impediment in his speech, which, in the hurry of repeating a lesson before a number of boys, was always increased. It was inculcated to him by his dame that he must look upon himself as the reverse of a woman in everything, and not hold that whoever deliberates is lost. Lord Harrington was a boy of much natural spirit. In the Great Rebellion under Forster, when all the boys threw their books into the Thames and marched to Salt Hill, he was amongst the foremost. At that place each took an oath, or rather swore, he would be deedy if ever he returned to school again. When therefore he came to London to the old Lord Harrington's, and sent up his name, his father would only speak to him at the door, insisting, at the same time, on his immediate return. "Sir," said the son, "consider I shall be D.D. if I do." "And I," answered the father, "will be D.D. if you don't." "Yes, my lord," replied the son, "but you will be D.D. together I do or no." The Storers, Anthony and Tom, for West Indians, were better scholars than usually fell to the share of those children of the sun, who were, in general, too gay to be great. The name of the elder stands to this day at the head of many good exercises, from which succeeding genius has stolen and been praised for it. Tom had an odd capability of running round a room on the edge of the wainscot, a strange power of holding by the foot, an art which, in lower life, might have been serviceable to him in the showing it. And Anthony, likewise, amongst better and more brilliant qualifications, had the reputation of being amongst the best dancers of the age. In a political line, perhaps, he did not dance attendance to much purpose. Harry Conway, brother to the present Marquis of tilde Hertford, though younger in point of learning, was older than his brother, Lord Beauchamp, but he was not so forward as to show this preeminence. A somewhat of modesty, a consciousness of being younger, always kept him back from displaying it. In fact, they were perfectly unlike two Irish boys the Wades, who followed them, and who, because the younger was taller, used to fight about which was the eldest. Pepys, a name well known for Barnard's commendation of it, and for his exercises in the Musae Etonenses. He was amongst the best poets that Eton ever produced. Kirkshaw, son to the late doctor, of Leeds, and since fellow of Trinity College. When his father would have taken him away, he made a singular request that he might stay a year longer, not wishing to be made a man so early. Many satiric Latin poems bear his name at Eton, and he continued that turn afterwards at Cambridge. He was remarkable for a very large head, but it should likewise be added, there was a good deal in it. On this head, his father used to hold forth in the country. He was, without a figure, the head of the school, and was afterwards in the caput at the university. Windham, under Barnard, distinguished himself very early as a scholar, and for a logical acuteness, which does not often fall to the share of a boy. He was distinguished too both by land and by water. For while he was amongst the most informed of his time, in school hours, in the playing fields, on the water, with the celebrated boatman, my guinea piper at cricket, or in rowing, he was always the foremost. He used to boast that he should in time be as good a boxer as his father was, though he used to add that never could be exactly known, as he could not decently have a set to with him. Falconer, the major, was captain of the school, and in those days was famed for the suaviter in modo, and for a turn for gallantry with the Windsor milliners, which he pursued up the 100 steps and over the terrace there. As this turn frequently made him overrun the hours of absence, on his return he was found out and flogged the next morning. But this abated not his zeal in the cause of gallantry, as he held it to be, like Ovid, whom he was always reading, suffering in a fair cause. Falconer, Everard minor, with the same turn for pleasure as his brother, but more open and ingenuous in his manner, more unreserved in his behavior, then manifested, what he has since been, the bon vivant of every society, and was then as since, the admired companion in every party. Prydox was remarkable for being the gravest boy of his time, and for having the longest chin. Had he followed the ancient sapientum passere barbem, there would in fact have been no end of it. With this turn, however, his time was not quite thrown away, nor his gravity. In conjunction with Dampier, Langley, and Serjeant, who were styled the learned cons, he composed a very long English poem in the same metre as the Bath Guide, and of which it was then held a favour to get a copy. He had so much of advanced life about him that the masters always looked upon him as a man, and this serious manner followed him through his pastimes. He was fond of billiards, but he was so long in making his stroke that no boy could bear to play with him. When the game, therefore, went against him, like Fabius cunctando restituit rem, and they gave it up rather than beat him. Hulse, amongst the best tennis players that Eton ever sent up to Windsor, where he always was. As a poet, he distinguished himself greatly by winning one of the medals given by Sir John Dalrymple. His ~82 exercise on this occasion was the subject of much praise to Dr. Forster, then master, and of much envy to his contemporaries in the sixth form, who said it was given to him because he was head boy. These were his arts, besides which he had as many tricks as any boy ever had. He had nothing when prepositor, and of course ruling under boys, of dignity about him, or of what might enforce his authority. When he ought to have been angry, some monkey trick always came across him, and he would make a serious complaint against a little boy in a hop, step, and a jump. Montague. having a great predecessor before him under the appellation of Mad Montague, had always a consolatory comparison in this way in his favor. In truth, at times he wanted it, for he was what has been termed a genius, but he was likewise so in talent. He was an admirable poet, and had a neatness of expression seldom discoverable at such early years. In proof may be brought a line from a Latin poem on cricket. Clavigeri fallit verbera verga cadit. And another on scraping a man down at the Robin Hood. Radet arenosum pes inimicus humum. The scratching of the foot on the sandy floor is admirable. During a vacation, Lord Sandwich took him to Holland, and he sported on his return a Dutch-built coat for many weeks. The boys used to call him Mynheer Montague, but his common habit of oddity soon got the better of his coat. He rose to be a young man of great promise, as to abilities, and died too immaturely for his fame. Tickel the elder. Manu magis quam capite should have been his motto. By natural instinct he loved fighting, and knew not what fear was. He went amongst his schoolfellows by the name of Hannibal and Old Tough. A brother schoolfellow of his, no less a man than the Marquis of Buckingham, met, and recognized him again in Ireland, and with the most marked solicitude of friendship did everything but assist him in obtaining a troop of dragoons, which he had much at heart. Tickel minor should then have had the eulogy of how much elder art thou than thy years. In those early days his exercises, read publicly in school, gave the anticipation of what time and advancing years have brought forth. He was an admirable scholar, and a poet from nature forcible, neat, and discriminating. The fame of his grandsire, the Tickel of Addison, was not hurt by the descent to him. His sister, who was the beauty of Windsor Castle and the admiration of all, early excited a passion in a boy then at school, who afterwards married her. Of this sister he was very fond, but he was not less so of another female at Windsor, a regard since terminated in a better way with his present wife. His pamphlet of anticipation, it is said, placed him where he since was under the auspices of Lord North, but his abilities were of better quality and deserved a better situation for their employment. Lord Plymouth, then Lord Windsor, had to boast some distinctions, which kept him aloof from the boys of his time. He was of that inordinate size that, like Falstaff, 4 square yards on even ground were so many miles to him, and the struggles which he underwent to raise himself when down might have been matter of instruction to a minority member. In the entrance to his dames, gate much circumspection was necessary, for, like some good men out of power, he found it difficult to get in. When in school or otherwise, he was not undeserving of praise, either as to temper or tilde 84 tilde scholarship. And whether out of the excellence of his Christianity or that of good humor, he was not very adverse to good living, and he continued so ever after. Lord Leicester had the reputation of good scholarship, and not undeservedly. In regard to poetry, however, he was sometimes apt to break the 8th commandment, and prove lie read more the Musae Etonenses than his prayer book. Inheriting it from Lord Townshend, the father of caricaturists, he there pursued, with nearly equal ability, that turn for satiric drawing. The master, the tutors, slender Prior, and fat Robertsall felt in rotation the effects of his pencil. There too, as well as since, he had a most venerable affection for heraldry, and the same love of collecting together old titles and obsolete mottos. Once in the military, he had, it may be said, a turn for arms. In a zeal of this kind, he once got over the natural mildness of his temper, and was heard to exclaim, "There are 2 griffins in my family that have been missing these 3 centuries, and by G, I'll have Illim back again." This passion was afterwards improved into so perfect a knowledge, that in the creation of peers he was applied to, that every due ceremonial might be observed, and he never failed in his recollection on these antiquated subjects. Tom Plummer gave then a specimen of that quickness and vivacity of parts, for which he was afterwards famed. But not as a scholar, not as a poet, was he quick alone. He was quick too in the wrong ends of things, as well as the right, with a plausible account to follow it. In fact, he was born for the law, clear, discriminating, judicious alive, and with a noble impartiality to all sides of questions, and which none could defend better. This goes, however, only to the powers of his head. In those of the heart no one, and in the best and tenderest qualities of it, ever stood better. He was liked universally, and should be so, for no man was ever more meritorious for being good, as he who had all the abilities which sometimes make a man otherwise. In the progress of life mind changes often, and body almost always. Both these rules, however, he lived to contradict, for his talents and his qualities retain their virtue, and when a boy he was as tall as when a man, and apparently the same. Capel loft. In the language of Eton, the word gig comprehended all that was ridiculous, all that was to be laughed at and plagued to death, and of all gigs that was, or ever will be, this gentleman, while a boy, was the greatest. He was like nothing, in the heavens above or the waters under the earth, and therefore he was surrounded by a mob of boys whenever he appeared. These days of popularity were not pleasant. Luckily, however, for himself, he found some refuge from persecution in his scholarship. This scholarship was much above the rate, and out of the manner of common boys. As a poet, he possessed fluency and facility, but not the strongest imagination. As a classic, he was admirable, and his prose themes upon different subjects displayed an acquaintance with the Latin idiom and phraseology seldom acquired even by scholastic life, and the practice of later years. Beyond this, he read much of everything that appeared, knew everything, and was acquainted with every better publication of the times. Even then he studied law, politics, divinity, and could have written well upon those subjects. These talents have served him since more effectually than they did then, more as man than boy. For at school he was a kind of graybeard. He neither ran, played, jumped, swam, or fought as other boys do. The descriptions of puerile years, so beautifully given by Gray in his ode. Who foremost, now delight to cleave with pliant arm thy glassy wave. The captive linnet which enthrall. What idle progeny succeed, to chase the rolling circle's speed, or urge the flying ball? All these would have been, and were, as nondescriptive of him as they would have been of the Lord Chancellor of England, with a dark brow and commanding mien, determining a cause of the first interest to this country. Added to this, in personal appearance he was most unfavored, and exemplified the Irish definition of an open countenance a mouth from ear to ear. Lord Hinchinbroke, from the earliest period of infancy, had all the marks of the Montagu family. He had a good head, and a red head, and a Roman nose, and a turn to the ars amatoria of Ovid, and all the writers who may have written on love. As it was in the beginning may be said now. Though in point of scholarship he was not in the very first line, the descendant of Lord Sandwich could not but have ability, and he had it. But this was so mixed with the wanderings of the heart, the vivacity of youthful imagination, and a turn to pleasure, that a steady pursuit of any one object of a literary turn could not be expected. But it was his praise that he went far in a short time, sometimes too far, for Bernard had to exercise himself, and his red right arm, as the vengeful poet expresses it, very frequently on the latter end of his lordship's excursions. In one of these excursions to Windsor, he had the good or ill fortune to engage in a little amorous ament with a young lady, the consequence of which was an application to Lucina for assistance. Of this Dr. Bernard was informed, and though the remedy did not seem tending towards a cure, he was brought up immediately to be flogged. He bore this better than his master, who cried out, after some few lashes, pshaw! What signifies my flogging him for being like his father? What's bred in the bone will never get out of the flesh. Gibbs. Some men are overtaken by the law, and some few overtake it themselves. In this small but happy number may be placed the name in question, and a name of better promise, whether of man or boy, can scarcely be found anywhere. At school he was on the foundation, and though amongst the collegers, where the views of future life and hope of better days, arising from their own industry, make learning a necessity, yet to that he added the better qualities of genius and talent. As a classical scholar, he was admirable in both languages. As a poet, he was natural, ready, and yet distinguished. Amongst the best exercises of the time, his were to be reckoned, and are yet remembered with praise. For the medals given by Sir John Dalrymple for the best Latin poem, he was a candidate. But though his production was publicly read by Dr. Forster, and well spoken of, he was obliged to give way to the superiority of another on that occasion. Describing the winding of the Thames through its banks, it had this beautiful line: Rodet arundinias, facili sinuamine repas. Perfect as to the picture, and beautiful as to the flowing of the poetry. He had the good fortune and the good temper to be liked by every body of his own age, and he was not enough found out of bounds or trespassing against sacred order to be disliked by those of greater age who were set over him. After passing through all the different forms at Eton, he was removed to Cambridge, where he distinguished himself not less than at school in trials for different literary honors. There he became assistant tutor to Sir Peter Burrell, who then listened to his instructions and has not since forgotten them. As a tutor, he was somewhat young, but the suavity of his manners took away the comparison of equality, and his real knowledge rendered him capable of instructing those who might be even older than himself. Apollo's visit to Eton, 1. T'other night, as Apollo was quaffing a gill with his pupils, the Muses, from Helicon's rill, for all circles of rank in Parnassus agree in preferring cold water to coffee or tea, the discourse turned as usual on critical matters, and the last stirring news from the kingdom of letters. But when poets and critics and wits, and what not from Geoffrey and Byron to Stoddart and Stott, too, had received their due portion of consideration, cried Apollo, "Pray, ladies, how goes education? For I own my poor brain's been so muddled of late, in transacting the greater affairs of the state, and so long every day in the courts I've been stewing, I've had no time to think what the children were doing. There's my favorite Byron my presence inviting, and Milman and Coleridge and Moore have been writing, and my ears at this moment confoundedly tingle from the squabbling of Blackwood with Cleghorn and Pringle. But as all their disputes seem at length at an end, and the poets my levee have ceased to attend, since the weather's improving and lengthen the days, for a visit to Eton I'll order my chaise." This poem, the reader will perceive, is an humble imitation of Leigh Hunt's Feast of the Poets, and the lines distinguished by asterisks are borrowed or altered from the original. To a writer in the Morning Post, mentioned by Lord Byron in his English Bards and Scotch Reviewers. "There's my sister Diana my day coach to drive, and I'll send the new canto to keep you alive. So my business all settled, and absence supplied, for an earthly excursion tomorrow I'll ride." Thus spoke King Apollo, the Muses assented, and the god went to bed most bepraised and contented. 'Twas on Saturday morning, near 11:30, when a god, like a devil forecame driving from heaven, and with postboys and footmen and liveries blazing, soon set half the country a gaping and gazing. When the carriage drove into the Christopher Yard, how the waiters all bustled, and Garraway stared, and the hostlers and boot-catchers wondered and swore. They'd ne'er seen such a start in their lifetime before. I could tell how, as soon as his chariot drew nigh, every cloud disappeared from the face of the sky, and the birds in the hedges more tunefully sung, and the bells incent. Georges spontaneously rung, and the people, all seized with divine inspiration, couldn't talk without rhyming and versification. But such matters, though vastly important, I ween, are too long for the limits of your magazine. Now it soon got abroad that Apollo was come, and intended to be, for that evening, at home, and that cards would be issued, and tickets be given to all scholars and wits for a dinner at 7. So he'd scarcely sat clown, when a legion came pouring of would-be-thought scholars, his favor imploring. First Buller stepped in, with a lengthy oration about scandalous usage and hard situation, and such treatment as never, since Eton was started, had been shown to a genius like him, broken-hearted. He'd no doubt but his friends in Parnassus must know how his fine declamation was laughed at below, and how Keat, like a blockhead ungifted with brains, had neglected to grant him a prize for his pains. He was sure, if such conduct continued much longer, the school must grow weaker and indolence stronger, that the rights of sixth form would be laid in the dust, and the school after that, he thought, tumble it must. But he knew that Apollo was learned and wise, and he hoped that his godship would give him a prize, or, at least, to make up for his mortification, would invite him to dinner without hesitation. Now Apollo, it seems, had some little pretense to a trifling proportion of wisdom and sense, so, without ever asking the spark to be seated, he thus cut short his hopes, and his projects defeated. After all, Mr. Buller, you've deigned to repeat, I'm afraid that you'll think me as stupid as Keat. But to waive all disputes on your talents and knowledge, pray, what have you done as the captain of college? Have you patronized learning, or sapping commended? Have you heir to your fags, or their studies attended? To the school have you given of merit a sample, and directed by precept, or led by example? What Apollo said more I'm forbidden to say, but Buller dined not at his table that day. Next, a smart little gentleman marched with a stare up, smoothing his neckcloth, and patting his hair up, and with bows and grimaces quadrillers might follow said. He owned that his face was unknown to Apollo. But he held in hand what must be his apology, a short treatise he'd written on British geology, and this journal he hoped of his studies last week, in philosophy, chemistry, logic, and Greek, might appear on perusal. But not to go far in proclaiming his merits, his name was Tom Carr, and for proofs of his talents, deserts, and what not, he appealed to Miss Bailey, Lord Byron, and Scott. Here his speech was cut short by a hubbub below, and in walked Messrs. Maturin, Cooksley, and Co., and begged leave to present to his Majesty's finger if he'd please to accept no. 5 of the linger, 5 Mr. Maturin hoped he the columns would view with unprejudiced judgment, and give them their due nor believe all the lies, which perhaps he had seen in that vile publication, that base magazine. 6. Which had dared to impeach his most chaste lucubrations, of obscenity, nonsense, and such accusations. Nay, that impudent work had asserted downright, that chalk differed from cheese, and that black wasn't white, but he hoped he might meet with his Majesty's favor. And thus, hemming and hawing, he closed his palaver. Now the god condescended to look at the papers, but the first word he found in them gave him the vapors. For the eyes of Apollo, ye gods. 'Twas a word quite unfit to be written, and more to be heard. 'Twas a word which a bargeman would tremble to utter, and it put his poor Majesty all in a flutter, but collecting his courage, his laurels he shook, and around on the company cast such a look, that e'en Turin and Dumpling slank off to the door, and the lion was far too much frightened to roar. 5. An Eton periodical of the time. 6. The college magazine. While poor Carr was attacked with such qualms at the breast, that he took up his journal, and fled with the rest. When the tumult subsided, and peace 'gan to follow, Goddard entered the room, with 3 cards for Apollo, and some papers which, hardly 5 minutes before, 3 respectable gownsmen had left at the door. With a smile of good humor the god looked at each, for he found that they came from Blunt, Chapman, and Nietzsche. 7. Blunt sent him a treatise of science profound, showing how rotten eggs were distinguished from sound, some remarks on debates, and some long-winded stories of society Whigs and society Tories, and 6 sheets and a half of a sage dissertation on the present most wicked and dull generation. From Chapman came lectures on Monk, and on piety, on Simeon, and learning and plays and sobriety, with most clear illustrations and critical notes, on his own right exclusive of canvassing votes. From Nietzsche came a medley of prose and of rhyme, satires, epigrams, sonnets, and sermons sublime. But he'd chosen all customs and rules to reverse, for his satires were prose, and Law's sermons were verse. Phoebus looked at the papers, commended all 3, and sent word he'd be happy to see them to tea. The affairs of the morning thus happily o'er, Phoebus pulled from his pocket 12 tickets or more, which the waiters were ordered forthwith to disperse, monks the most approved scribblers in prose and in verse. Monks the gentlemen honored with cards, let me see, there was Howard and Coleridge and Wood and Lavey, the society's props, Curzon, major and minor. 7. Principal contributors to the Etonian. Bowen, Henniker, Webb were invited to dinner. The theologist Buxton and Petty were seen, and philosopher Jennings and Donald MacLean Bulteel too, and Dykes. But it happened, oh shame, that though many were asked, very few of them came. As for Coleridge, he knew not what right Phoebus had, D.N. me, to set up for a judge in a Christian academy, and he'd not condescend to submit his Latinity, nor his verses, nor Greek, to a heathen divinity. For his part, he should think his advice an affront, full as bad as the libels of Chapman and Blunt. He'd no doubt but his dinner might be very good, but he'd not go and taste it be D.D. if he would. Dean feared that his pupils their minds should defile, and Maclean was engaged to the Duke of Argyll. In a deep fit of lethargy, Petty had sunk, and theologist Buxton with Bishop was drunk, Bulteel too, and Dykes, much against their own will, had been both pre-engaged to a party to mill, and philosopher Jennens was bent on his knees to electrify spiders and galvanize fleas. But the rest all accepted the god's invitation and made haste to prepare for this jollification. Now the dinner was handsome as dinner could be, but to tell every dish is too tedious for me. Such a task, at the best, would be irksome and long, and besides, I must haste to the end of my song. 'Tis enough to relate that, the better to dine, Jove sent them some nectar and Bacchus some wine. From Minerva came olives to crown the dessert, and from Helicon water was sent most alert, of which Howard, 'tis said, drank so long and so deep that he almost fell into poetical sleep. When the cloth was removed, and the bottle went round, nec font labra proluisi abelino, nec in bicipedi samus Parnasso. Persius. Wit, glee, and good humor began to abound, though Lord Chesterfield would not have called them polite, for they all often burst into laughter outright. But swift flew the moments of rapture and glee, and too early, alas. They were summoned to tea. With looks most demure, each prepared with a speech, at the table were seated Blunt, Chapman, and Nietzsche. Phoebus stopped their orations, with dignity free, and with easy politeness shook hands with all three, and the party proceeded, increased to a host, to discuss bread and butter, tea, coffee, and toast. As their numbers grew larger, more loud grew their mirth, and Apollo from heaven drew its raptures to earth. With divine inspiration he kindled each mind, till their wit, like their sugar, grew double refined, and an evening, enlivened by conviviality, proved how much they were pleased by the god's hospitality. Thalia's 9. This poem is attributed to J. Moultrie-esque, of Trinity College, Cambridge. Eton Montem. Stand by, old cant, while I admire